Greetings, citizens of the world. As the massive armies of both the Russian Federation and United States NATO assemble on the battlefields Europe today, a grave new Security Council (SC) report circulating in the Kremlin today all but confirms what has long been rumored to be true, and that is both Russia and China are preparing to deliver the final death blow to America, from which this nation may never recover from in our lifetime. According to this report, at the BRICS 2017 summit meeting last week in China, the concerning parties attending agreed to launch a retaliatory economic strike against the United States unless the Americans acceded to two demands. 1. The Americans immediately stabilize the collapse of the U.S. dollar, and 2. The Americans make a sustained and concentrated effort to keep their national debt limit below $20 trillion. Rather than accede to these demands, this report continues, President Donald Trump, instead, sided with his nation's Communistic Democratic Party to blow aside America's debt limit, and that within hours caused America's national debt to cross the historical red line of $20 trillion, thus accelerating the worst plunge in value of the U.S. dollar since the signing of the Plaza Accord. The Plaza Accord, this report explains, is the 1985 agreement made between the governments of the United States, France, West Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom, to depreciate the U.S. dollar in relation to the Japanese yen and German Deutsche Mark by their deliberately intervening in global money markets in order to manipulate the true value, worth of these currencies, and that was made in gross violation of 1947 Bretton Woods Agreement that mandated all currencies be pegged to the price of gold, with the U.S. dollar being placed as the only reserve currency to be used in all international transactions. Even worse, this report details, when combined with the 1971 Nixon shock, when President Richard Nixon abruptly announced that the U.S. would longer pay its international debts in gold, the Plaza Accord solidified what is known as the petrodollar system, and that mandated that no nation on earth could buy oil or natural gas unless they paid for them with U.S. dollars that could only be obtained from the United States, but whose full diabolical plot was, in fact, a subsidy granted, in real terms, to oil importing nations such as the United States, Germany, France, and Japan. With every oil and natural gas importing nation on earth having to buy U.S. dollars in order to survive, this report continues, the United States, over these past nearly 4 decades, has been able to use this vast money-making scheme to build up the world's largest military force to keep its petrodollar system in force, but that has so distorted all rational economic reality, its dystopian statistics boggle the mind in trying to comprehend them, as the Americans have created the largest crisis to ever face our world, and whose disasters include global debt of $230 trillion, that can never be repaid, nor financed when rates normalized. Unfunded global liabilities of $250 trillion, that will never be honored. Central banks' balance sheets over $20 trillion, because they are all insolvent. U.S. insolvent, and only supported by military power. Most industrialized and emerging countries only surviving by printing money out of thin air, which is untenable. Interest rates at 0 or below in 20 U.S.-aligned countries, which is unsustainable. Paper money system, all of whose currencies are going to zero. A final death blow to America is therefore immediately needed, this report says, in order to save our world from a total economic collapse, and whose form will begin, on 18th of October, when China holds its 5-year annual Communist Party Congress, and where China, the largest oil importer in the world, will launch a crude oil futures contract denominated in Chinese yuan and convertible into gold, thus creating the most important Asian oil benchmark and allowing oil exporters to bypass forever the petrodollar system. With China, in effect, returning the world to its 1947 Bretton Woods Agreement state, condition wherein gold, and gold only, is used to settle international debts for the payment of oil and natural gas, this report notes. President Trump's U.S. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin was rushed to the United States' main gold depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, to examine its contents, and was the first time since 1948 that any U.S. Treasury Secretary had done so. As to why President Trump ordered for the first time in 69 years that America's gold in Fort Knox be verified as really being there, this report explains, is due to the United States suspiciously, and mysteriously, continuing to lose its annual Fort Knox audit reports mandated by U.S. law, with many experts believing it was secretly all sold off in the mid-1970s following the Nixon shock, thus solidifying the petrodollar system. If the United States gold reserves are truly gone, this report notes, its economy will immediately crash because it will be unable to purchase the Chinese currency it would need buy oil on the international market, and that it will be, also, unable to replace with its own oil reserves as nearly all of the publicly traded energy companies in the U.S. are now spending an astonishing 75% of their operating cash flow just to pay the interest on the debt they owe. If the United States would be able to continue their petrodollar system charade with Saudi Arabia alone, this report continues, appears to be highly unlikely as this Middle East nation's foreign exchange reserves have now plunged below the critical $500 billion level and currently stand at $494 billion, and who are now, also, openly negotiating with China to replace the US dollar for the purchasing of its vast oil wealth, and whose only hope for long-term survival is by their selling a 5% stake in its nearly century-old Saudi Arabian oil company, Saudi Aramco, that it has valued between $1.50 and $2 trillion, and that Russia is maneuvering to buy, and China too. With the United States, therefore, knowing its petrodollar system is nearing total collapse, this report warns, its inability to pay with gold for the oil it needs before its economy collapses in upon itself, and when combined with its own domestic oil producers going bankrupt, shows clearly that America is now in its death throes and whose only option left for survival is war. And with the United States now flooding South America with troops for their planned invasion of Venezuela, who have the largest oil reserves on earth, and whose Islamic terrorist forces in Syria, the only significant oil-producing country in the eastern Mediterranean region, are now desperately racing to steal that nation's oil wealth too. This report grimly continues, when combined with the massive military forces they've amassed in Europe, all that's needed now is a spark to ignite World War III. Though Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has, once again, warned the Americans that they are in violation of international law by even being in Syria, this report says, the United States, nevertheless, continues to blindly fumble around there seeming to be oblivious to the reality that their Islamic terrorists are nearly totally defeated, and who only have left barely 15% of the territory they once controlled, all made possible by Russia's massive, and unrelenting, obliteration of these US-backed terrorists whose looming total defeat marks a turning point in the modern Middle East, but with a grave new warning now being issued that in their losing Syria, the United States will now target Russia more than ever. As to whom, exactly, in the United States will target Russia, though, this report concludes, remains uncertain as troubling new reports coming from America state that President Trump is now isolated after his longtime bodyguard, Keith Schiller, was forced out of the White House, and by Trump being so isolated now, according to one of America's top political experts Roger Stone, his deep state enemies are now putting massive amounts of drugs in his food and water as part of their plot to overthrow him in a coup by declaring that he is not mentally fit anymore to lead this once great nation.